Thank you so much, Marcel, and thank you so much to CPB for inviting me. It's a huge honor. I don't do these lectures. I don't basically give lectures. This is something for academics like Ruhl. So it's a big honor, and I'm also slightly nervous. So let me just jump in. I changed the title just a little bit to make it slightly sexier, if you like, how to green the EU's fiscal framework. And let me start by giving you the essence of the argument. So I will argue that there's a strong prima facie case for privileging, meaning creating incentives for, or if you like, protecting green public investment in the EU fiscal framework. I will argue that the proposal that is currently in the legislative process, although it takes a small step in that direction, falls well short. And then I will argue that it is possible to design a green fiscal rule that does three things. It safeguards debt sustainability. So in that sense, it's fiscally conservative. It adequately protects or incentivizes green investment, and it stays close to the spirit and letter of the current proposal. So it is arguably politically feasible, but you may disagree with me on that. But I'm really trying to sort of reconcile the fiscal and debt sustainability, the debt and the environmental sustainability aspects here. So if you like, this is a profoundly Dutch proposal. So let me start with the case for a green fiscal rule. I will give you what I call the sort of generic philosophical argument, and then I will give you a more specific arguments that also shows you some charts. So the generic argument for a green fiscal rule is essentially an extension of the generic case for, or the generic argument that there is a distortion that has to do with our political systems that tends to favor current spending over investment spending. And that is that government incentives in democracies tend to be relatively short-term, for the most part aligned with the electoral horizon. Current spending has an immediate impact on the voters, so does public investment, but here the impact is shared between the current voters and future voters who may not be represented at the polls. And so governments tend to underinvest to the extent that there is a trade-off between current spending and investment spending. Given a budget constraint, they would push the investment side. And of course, in the case of green public investment, this distortion could be very massive because public investment in the next 5 to 10 years in the EU and elsewhere in the world will determine the welfare of all future generations, not just the current and the next one. But it could require quite large sacrifices of the current generation, and so that distortion is enhanced. And if you face the distortion, then, like always in our constitutional and political systems, we tend to define framework conditions, laws, that balance these distortions and then produce a better long-run outcome. And so the question is how to do that. Okay, now the specific argument is the following, and so here I get a bit into numbers. So the estimated green total investment needs are quite large in the EU, about 2% of GDP per year, in addition to achieve the Fit for 55 emissions reduction targets by 2030, which some of you may argue is still not enough. But this is just to reach the targets that have been adopted by the EU. So these are two sets of estimates. One comes from a European Commission paper of 2020, and the other one comes from a very nice new study by Jean Pisani-Ferry, who is also affiliated with Bruegel. He was the founding director, and Selma Mahfouz in a report for the French Prime Minister, and they come up with rather similar numbers, about 2.5% of GDP in additional investment until 2030. Now, of course, additional investment doesn't mean just public investment, it means also private investment, and so there is a question how this is split between the public and the private sector, and this is a very controversial question. So what you sometimes hear from, say, my conservative friends in Germany is, yes, there's a significant investment need, but it doesn't involve the public sector, only minimally. We could raise carbon prices very high and then let the private sector do it. And that is not completely true, and the reason is that some of this investment is public infrastructure that is really provided by the public sector, and a lot of it has to do also with public buildings, like energy efficiency in public buildings. So there's some controversy of how big the public share is, but the estimates are around 30 to 50%, and then there are some bottom-up papers that actually suggest a higher number. So, a reasonable assumption is about 1% of GDP per year, but maybe you can go up to 1.8% of GDP per year, and that is substantial. Now, the reason why it is substantive, it may not sound so high to you, is that it comes at a bad time, okay, this extra spending. Namely, at a time when EU countries are expected to lower their public deficits quite massively, right? And the reason, of course, why we're expected to lower them is because they are unusually high right now, and they are unusually high because we are in the aftermath of two shocks, pandemic and then energy. And so it's a bad time to come up with much more money for green investment. So the chart gives you projections of the structural primary balance. So this is the excess of revenues over non-interest spending, so all spending except for interest spending in the euro area. And you can see that, so the 22 values is a realized value. The 23 and 24 values are European Commission and IMF projections. So there's a green line that is European Commission and a blue line that is IMF. Then you see from 24 on, this sort of fan starts diverging. So what is in this fan? The blue line is the latest projection of the IMF World Economic Outlook. So they don't think that we will tighten a whole lot. They think it will not be very ambitious. They believe that there will be some tightening, but not super ambitious. Then these yellow and red lines are our Bruegel calculations from this paper that's cited here of what the draft new fiscal framework would imply. So this is the aspiration of the new fiscal rules. And which of these lines applies has to do with whether countries are given a 7-year horizon to adjust or a 4-year horizon to adjust, and whether the proposal includes the so-called safeguards that I will talk about in a second, or does not include them. But the point is that even in the least ambitious variant here, it's going to be substantially more tight and continuing to be tight for several years than it was in the past. And this is the time when we're supposed to make this big effort to fix our climate problem. Now, the reason why this is worrisome is because generally times of fiscal consolidation lead to disproportionate adjustment at the expense of public investment. And so this is a very simplistic chart. There are much more sophisticated ways of making this argument. This is simply shows simply indices of euro area revenue, public investment, and expenditure. So this is non-investment expenditure, other expenditure, as a share of GDP. So the index is normalized to 2009, the year just after the financial crisis, when the recession was starting to hit, is defined as 100. And then you see how these levels changed. And the main point here is that there was a lot of pressure to adjust, right? Because interest rates went up a lot. We had the euro area debt crisis. And of course, there was a large recession. And so, deficits went up a lot. And so this tells you in a very crude way how the adjustment burden was split. So remember, these are indices not of levels of revenue, but of revenues as a share of GDP. So one adjustment consisted in raising revenue as a share of GDP. That's the blue line, so it goes up. Another adjustment was to massively cut investment. That's the green line. It just collapses. And then you have a little bit of adjustment of non-investment expenditure, but hardly anything. right? So faced with these three options, do we cut investment, do we cut current spending, or do we raise taxes? Euro area countries went disproportionately for the cutting of investment, and to a lesser extent for raising revenue. Okay, so the argument is that first we need to substantially raise green public investment at a time when we need to also lower public deficits, namely in the next 5 to 8 years. In times of consolidation need, public investments tends to suffer disproportionately. And that means that to the extent that these consolidation needs are policy influenced, for example, through the design of a new euro area or EU fiscal framework, critical investment should be shielded from consolidation pressures. So that's sort of my advice as an economist. And this argument applies disproportionately to green investment because, if you like, it is extra critical in the next 5 to 8 years. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about the proposal that is on the table and why it is not good enough. So the proposal that's on the table consists of three main elements. First, there will be country-specific, country-by-country, medium-term fiscal adjustment requirements based on essentially projections of how debt will evolve that, contain assumptions about a country's growth potential, the interest rates, and the external environment. It's a full accounting of all the relevant drivers of public debt, and so this is put together in a systematic framework called a debt sustainability analysis. Essentially, the question is, what does it take in terms of a fiscal adjustment over a period of 4 to 7 years to make sure that after that adjustment period, debt does not explode. Now, to make sure that the debt ratio does not explode, if you have some uncertainty, you need it to come down under baseline assumptions, right? Okay, in addition, the adjustment must be high enough to meet the 3% deficit benchmark because someone came up with that in Maastricht, and we need to respect that because it's kind of hard to change. It's not completely unreasonable either. It's arbitrary but not unreasonable. So what this approach is a very drastic departure philosophically from the current approach, which has these little quantitative rules that over time became more and more complicated, and so they evolved from quantitative benchmarks to formulas. But the formulas are still ad hoc. They were essentially politically negotiated. They're not based on any projection, on any probabilistic debt sustainability analysis. Why did we move from this rules-based approach to an analytical approach? Well, one rationalization is that it's motivated by sort of an efficiency argument, or if you like, a subsidiarity argument. We really have no basis at the EU level to require more fiscal adjustment of countries than is needed for either debt sustainability, which is the purpose of the EU fiscal framework, or to satisfy the treaty, right? Otherwise, countries should be sovereign and decide what they do. And behind this idea, of course, is the fact that because enforcement of the EU fiscal rules is so difficult, the only way we can really expect countries to follow the rules is to be reasonable about them, for the rules to make sense. So in a paper that I wrote with Olivier Blanchard about this, sort of making a proposal that is in the spirit, I have a footnote where I used an example from a very famous German children's book that hopefully many of you have read, which is Emil und die Detektive. It's about this little boy who goes to Berlin, and then his money is stolen on the train. And then he goes out and tries to recover the money, and while he does that, he meets kids, 11, 12-year-olds in Berlin, and they're all very independent, as kids are in Berlin, I think also here. And so he asks these kids, because he comes from this little town, why do your parents just allow you to do what you like? And said, well, my old man is great. He allows me to do what I like, so long as I don't put myself at risk and I do nothing indecent. Okay, that's the proposal. And this is the philosophy of the new fiscal rules. Okay, now the second element is, the EU fiscal rules are so difficult that the only way we can really expect countries to follow the rules is to be reasonable about them, for the rules to make sense. So in a paper that I wrote with Olivier Blanchard about this, sort of making a proposal that is in the spirit, I have a footnote where I used an example from a very famous German children's book that hopefully many of you have read, which is Emil und die Detektive. It's about this little boy who goes to Berlin, and then he goes out and tries to recover the money, and while he does that, he meets kids, 11, 12-year-olds in Berlin, and so he asks these kids, because he comes from this little town, why do your parents just allow you to do what you like? And The baseline adjustment period is supposed to be 4 years, but it can be extended to 7 years if countries commit to credible reform and investment plans. And so this is to create incentives for reform and to allow high-debt countries to lower debt by means other than austerity, namely by raising growth. Also a good idea in my opinion. And then the third thing is something that was put in there largely as a result of to meet a political compromise, to essentially get Germany and some of the fiscally conservative countries, to a lesser extent including the Netherlands, on board, which is, they say, a set of safeguards. So these are simple rules dictating minimum deficit and debt reduction objectives. And so these rules, you can see philosophically, they contradict the first set, right? Because, you know, in Minute Detektive, that boy, in principle, should be able to go home as long as he doesn't put himself or others at risk at any time, to bed at any time. And the safeguard is like saying you have to be in bed. You can be, you know, maybe on the late side, but 10 is the absolute maximum. You have to be back at 10. And now, is this bad or is this good? Well, it depends a little bit on how late the cutoff is. If the cutoff is late enough, it will not substantively undermine the freedom of the boy. So why was this put in? It was put in because many member states mistrust this analytical instrument, that sustainability analysis. It's controlled by the European Commission. No one really knows what they are doing there. And so there was a justified fear that this would be abused politically, that it would give the Commission too much discretion, that they would then get a phone call from a large member state, France. Somehow the Germans never think of themselves as making that phone call. And then there would be basically some fudging of that thing, and for that you need the safeguards. Now, we wrote a paper about this about 2 months ago, and we made the argument, if you want to prevent them from fudging, why don't you actually prevent them from fudging? Namely, make this methodology public, make it a common methodology, and check whether it's implemented or not. So that's the first order, I think, response to that. But that was not the proposed response. It's been now, I think, considered, our idea, in the Spanish presidency's compromise, but the main idea was we put in these extra safeguards. And so this is the safeguards. In the latest iteration, there's something that has to do with not postponing adjustment to the last minute, which I actually agree with. So the no backloading safeguard is the one I really agree with. Then there are these safeguards dictating minimum debt reductions. And the most important one is the first one, where debt at the end of this 4 to 7 year adjustment period must be lower than before. And I don't like that because it interferes with the DSA. Then there is something that says if you have an excessive deficit, which is a deficit of more than 3% of GDP, you need a minimum fiscal effort of 0.5% of GDP while the deficit is excessive, so this is also somewhat arbitrary. And finally, there's another safeguard that has to do with targeting a final deficit after adjustment that is actually somewhat higher than the 3% of GDP. I have some sympathies for this, but if you set this target too ambitious, you're going to kill half of the South. So there's some trade-offs in there. It has to do exactly with how it's set. Okay, now in what sense is the proposed framework a bit green? In two ways. First, it lowers the required annual, not necessarily the total, but the annual fiscal adjustment effort for countries with EU-endorsed public investment plans. And one of the ways, among several, to get this EU endorsement is if it is part of your Fit for 55 strategy. So in that sense, it does privilege not just green investment, but specifically green investment. And finally, if you are doing this public investment, you will get a limited exception to the no backloading safeguard. I will not go over that in detail. The main problem, however, and why this is not going far enough, is that public investment, including green, remains constrained by these other safeguards, even if it is EU endorsed, and even if it is structured in a way that makes it consistent with that sustainability and the 3% deficit benchmark. Okay, so you can have investment that checks all the boxes. It's really needed, countries can afford it, it doesn't violate the treaty, and still it would be ruled out under the system because of these safeguards. And so give me a minute to explain this. So what you have here is a little example. where a country starts with a big deficit, 4%, and then it puts out an adjustment plan. And the adjustment plan refers to this object called the primary balance, right? The difference between non-interest spending and revenue. And so that primary balance initially is also in deficit. And then the idea is that over 7 years, it is raised to be in surplus. Now, at the same time, this country comes up with this, 1% of GDP annual extra investment, which is green investment. This is this green line. And as a result of that, the fact that this green investment goes up, in spite of the fact that the current primary balance is being raised, the primary balance initially dips down, and the debt jumps up. That's the blue line. So the combination of the high initial deficit and this temporary investment plan, which is debt finance, leads to a rise, not a fall, a rise of the debt ratio, this is the blue line, over these 7 years. But then the point is that after 7 years, the investment plan is done. In the meantime, the fiscal adjustment has happened. And so the primary balance, which is this purple line, is more than enough to then bring down the debt ratio rapidly. Now, there's of course a question, would countries do this, right? But if countries do this, so if they pursue this parallel strategy of having some underlying fiscal adjustment and a temporary investment plan, you can perfectly reconcile debt sustainability, which is the falling of this blue line, with green investment, albeit at the cost of temporarily raising debt. And that thing is forbidden under the current rules, right? So this bump cannot happen because this is supposed to be, at the end of the 7 years, you're supposed to be below, the blue line is supposed to be below where it was at the beginning. So I'm almost done. I'm just now going to tell you how to solve the problem. Okay, so a lot of what I said is on the slides, what is already implicit. So I'm now putting on my economist hat, my fiscal economist hat. So from the perspective of fiscal sustainability, if that's what you want, it is fine for public investment to be paid for by a rise in net debt under two assumptions. The first is when the investment pays for itself, right? So that's the trivial case, when you have fee-generating public investment or cost-reducing public investment. Then, of course, you don't need to worry about repaying that in debt because it will generate its own revenues to repay itself. But even if the investment does not pay for itself, and for the most part, green investment does not pay for itself. So, quick check here. Green investment can be economically efficient and indeed essential, but still not pay for itself. Paying for itself means it generates the revenues or the growth that then offsets the extra cost of the investment. So if I'm now coming up with an adaptation investment, but if Holland builds sufficient seawalls to prevent a sea level rise from flooding over Holland, this means that Holland will exist in the future. It doesn't mean that Holland will grow faster in the future, right? That's the distinction. Okay, so what happens then? When is it responsible? When is it fiscally responsible to debt finance investment that does not pay for itself? Well, if the investment progress is temporary, so it leads to a level increase in debt, say by 20 points of GDP, 30 points of GDP, rather than a permanent increase in the deficit. It doesn't lead to debt rising year after year after year. And at the same time, if at the end of this investment program, the primary balance is high enough to rule out an explosion of debt with high probability, implying declining debt under baseline assumptions. So this is this example, right, where the primary balance is high enough to force the debt ratio to then come down. And for that, you may need to undertake fiscal adjustment while you're doing the investment program. Okay, and the problem is that essentially solution 2 is ruled out by the current fiscal rules because the safeguards can make this strategy impossible, as shown in the example. So there are two ways of fixing the problem. There's what we call the small solution, which is let's just adjust these safeguards so that they allow additional debt and additional deficits to the extent that it is motivated by financing green investment. That's solution number one. Now, important here for those fiscal conservatives in the audience, I'm never arguing to take this debt financing of green investment out of the DSA, right? So it's not that this is ignored. There are versions of this thing called a pure golden rule, where you're basically telling people, look, any investment is fair game, we will not worry about it. And let's just apply fiscal rules only to current spending. That's not what I'm proposing here. There's still an umbrella that includes both current and spending and green investment, in the sense that there is, the intertemporal budget constraint applies to the sum of the two. It's obvious, right? It needs to be repaid. So this is the sense, and perhaps the only sense, in which I agree with my Minister of Finance, Christian Lindner, who says debt is debt. Debt will need to be repaid. The markets don't look at why debt is generated. So I agree with that. But you take it out of these safeguards, which in any case are a bit artificial. Now, the problem of this approach, which, by the way, I think has a chance of being implemented, at least I tried to convince your Minister of Finance of it about an hour ago, is that the horizon of this green investment program would be limited to 7 years, right? Because you could only do this for the duration of the adjustment period. Because after that, you need to show that debt is sustainable, right? And the idea is that the primary fiscal balance in your fiscal plans needs to stay constant outside this horizon. So it gives you a pretty tight deadline, 7 years. 7 years may not be long enough. So what happens if 7 years is not long enough? Then, well, you could have essentially a more expansive version of this, which I call a fiscally responsible green golden rule, and it would work like this. So at the beginning of the adjustment period, so this would be 2024, you separate debt and deficits into a portion attributable to an EU-endorsed green investment program and the non-green rest. Then you apply the standard DSA 3% and all the safeguards you want to the non-green part. And then you allow an EU-endorsed green investment program of arbitrary length and cost, so long as it is accompanied by fiscal adjustment, such that after the end of the program, the primary balance is high enough to ensure the decline of the overall debt with high probability. So effectively, what you would be doing here is you would be allowing investment programs beyond the 7 years, provided there's some adjustment accompanying these investment programs that also extends beyond the seven years. Now, the question then is, what if countries don't do the adjustment? Well, both things happen at the same time, right? So if countries don't do the adjustment, you can basically call this whole thing off. And in the meantime, they will have done some adjustment, which helps them repay the debt that is already incurred. And calling the whole thing off means, in technical terms, you put them into the so-called excessive deficit procedure, which is sort of a weird way of punishing countries that have done the wrong thing, and for some reason has had real effects. There are some papers that show that. So my conclusion is the proposed fiscal framework could and probably should be amended by a fiscally responsible green golden rule that allows increases in the debt ratio to finance green investment conditional on simultaneous fiscal adjustment. This works conceptually because the investment push is temporary, while the underlying fiscal adjustment is permanent. It's a flow adjustment. The other is just a stock rise in debt, and hence a limited time-limited increase in investment can be paid for by a much smaller increase in the primary balance, which is permanent. But I argue it would also work practically because it would only apply to programs that are individually endorsed at the EU level, so it's no free-for-all, and if the promised adjustments does not happen, the authorization to raise debt to finance the program could be withdrawn. Let me stop. Thank you so much.